Hello, thank you all for joining me. I'm really thrilled to be sharing my most recent research with you all, so thanks for taking the time to be here listening. For those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Lucy Bolger from the University of Melbourne, and today I'm sharing my most recent program of research into musical pleasure as a potential mechanism of action in music therapy. I've been working on this research with close collaborator Kat McFerrin, who I'm sure you all know. So while she's not here today, these ideas have been generated and are still being progressed further in close partnership with Kat. Oops. First, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and the Bunurong peoples, the traditional owners of the unceded land that we met on for the AMTA conference in 2025 and on which my research has been undertaken. I want to pay my respects to elders, past, present and future, and extend that respect to any Indigenous people listening today. And now I want to talk about pleasure, specifically musical pleasure, that deep, embodied and very personal feeling of pleasure that we can have in response to musical experiences and encounters. Most people have at least a few go-to songs that they know consistently evoke a feeling of pleasure or deep enjoyment for them. Pleasure-inducing tracks, as we've come to call them in our research. And it's this specific pleasure response that we're interested in and that we've been researching for the past 3 years so far. Specifically, we're exploring the question, is musical pleasure a distinct mechanism of action in music therapy? In other words, does the presence of musical pleasure as part of a music therapy interaction impact the effectiveness of that interaction? For a long time, we've known from neuroscience that listening to pleasurable music can increase brain activity in areas associated with reward and pleasure, and that pleasurable music can stimulate dopamine release. That's that chills response we're all familiar with. More recent work has identified that pleasure responses for music listening appear to come from a combination of musical predictability and moments of surprise. So it's an interesting and a complex phenomenon. Despite this evidence from neuroscience, the music therapy discourse has historically not placed a great deal of emphasis on pleasure and enjoyment as a focus or an intention of our work. That fun, the joy, the play that we've all experienced in music therapy interactions and that are commonly reported as highly valued by our participants has mostly been downplayed in the way we characterize our work or positioned as a secondary or a bonus outcome, in favour of more professional and functional goals that show our credibility and value as serious healthcare professionals. This more medicalised and developmental focus is understandable as we've been establishing ourselves as a healthcare profession. However, I'm going to share our research findings now to demonstrate why I think we should be centering musical pleasure as a unique and discipline-specific pathway to therapeutic impact across the spectrum of chronic and mental health care. It's the study of anhedonia that's led to our current thinking about musical pleasure. Anhedonia is a transdiagnostic symptom that's described as a reduction in the ability to experience pleasure from positive experiences that previously felt pleasurable. Significantly for us as music therapists, anhedonia is a key symptom of most chronic and mental health conditions, many of which, as you can see from the slide, are regularly referred to music therapy. Alongside the reduced feeling of pleasure or reward, people with anhedonia experience a lack of motivation, general apathy, and social withdrawal. Clinically, what this might look like in your practice is people reporting a decreased ability to make decisions, very limited motivation, and muted feelings of pleasure or joy in everyday experiences like eating, time with friends, and making music. As you can imagine, this can really impact participants' ability to commit to therapy and health supports, and research shows that people with anhedonia have worse health outcomes overall. This can result from reduced adherence to treatment due to impaired decision-making and motivation, but studies have also found that the treatment of comorbid symptoms such as depression, depressed mood or agitation can also exacerbate anhedonia, creating something of a treatment paradox. Currently, there's no widely recognised effective treatments for anhedonia, so we have this debilitating symptom that's known to be experienced by people with many of the chronic and mental health disorders that we work with as music therapists. It's known to have a negative impact on recovery and overall health outcomes, and there's no established treatment. Imagine if music therapy was focused on this symptom. I came to this research through lived experience of anhedonia due to chronic pain and cancer treatment. When I had word from my experience of anhedonia, finally, the researcher in me did a deep dive. Positive affect treatment by Michelle Kraske and her colleagues was the only psychological or pharmacological treatment that seemed to be at all helpful in the treatment of anhedonia without creating negative side effects, seemingly because most psychological interventions are designed to decrease negative affect rather than increase positive affect. Kraske's study aimed to increase positive affect by targeting deficits in reward anticipation, initial response to reward, and reward learning across 15 sessions. They focused on positive valence systems, beginning with a module on pleasant event scheduling, followed by attending to the positive through cognitive exercises, and then cultivating the positive through loving kindness, generosity, appreciative joy, and gratitude. This study indicated that targeting positive valence systems had some preliminary efficacy, and it prompted me to think about how music might target positive valence systems in a similar way. Drawing from my lived experience, but also recognizing my motivational barriers due to anhedonia, Kat and I teamed up to experiment with developing a scaffolded, daily, pleasure-focused music intervention. This became our first study into anhedonia and musical pleasure. We implemented and analysed a daily guided music activity protocol for 3 months, and I'm happy to report this resulted in a mitigation of my anhedonia symptoms. So that was academically a great result, and personally a very, very positive result, and I'm glad to say an enduring outcome. So we wrote that case study up, but recognising that I'm quite an experienced music therapist, and we embarked on 2 more case studies to see if others with anhedonia who didn't have my expertise in music therapy could have a similar experience. So what I'd like to do now is to give you a combined overview of the learning from the initial and subsequent case studies to explain what we currently know about this approach to working with anhedonia with an explicit focus on musical pleasure. The broad structure of our intervention in this research was brief daily music activity undertaken independently by participants, supported by the music therapist through daily text prompts and regular check-in sessions for planning and debriefing. These 2 aspects of the intervention have been the foundation of each case study so far, and in each case, they've been tailored flexibly and specifically over time in response to the presentation and trajectory of each participant. So to first share some basic data with you, here you can see the different types of daily music activity that the 3 participants used, and this was really dependent on the individual participants' musical interest and their resources, the activities that they found brought them musical pleasure. And here, is an example of a weekly plan, including some proposed activity, a song, and a time of day. This plan was flexible, but it offered a structure to work within, to minimise the day-to-day pleasure of decision-making that can really be a challenge for people with anhedonia. So that was the general structure of the work. Now I'd like to highlight some critical features of this particular approach to practice that we identified through our analysis. We identified several therapeutic principles that were important to this intervention, some of which were unique or uncommon to music therapy practice more broadly. Firstly, we required a high dosage of music activity, daily in fact, that was undertaken independently by the participants at their own time. And we brought a specific narrow focus on musical pleasure to this daily activity. We aimed to increasingly develop participants' understanding and recognition of what musical pleasure is and how it feels, and to regularly remind them that musical pleasure is the specific focus of their daily music activity. The music activity was also easy and quick to do. It just took 5 to 10 minutes a day. And this was important because anhedonia strongly impacts people's motivation and their decision making. So the daily task needed to be easily achievable and could be changed by the participant in the moment if they wanted. And the understanding that decision making and motivation were barriers, we also planned and structured the activities in advance with participants and provided daily text prompts like the example that you can see on the screen here to compensate for some of these barriers. The role of the therapist is evolving over time, and as participants gain more awareness and mastery over their reconnection to musical pleasure. Based on our studies so far, we believe a significant existing relationship to music is an essential precondition for this intervention. it appears that a past experience of finding music pleasurable is important to be able to draw on, to have something to reconnect to through this process. The 3 participants who've completed the study so far have all had strong relationships with music, and we're very interested in how this may have impacted their outcomes. I hope this gives you an idea of the therapy protocol that we've been developing and using in this research. In particular, the very high dosage of music, the unique and highly flexible role of the therapist in the process, and the targeted focus on musical pleasure are elements of this work that stand out to me as quite unique features of this work that offer some interesting potentials for use as a discipline to consider, for us as a discipline to consider, So, as well as refining and articulating the protocol itself, we were of course very interested in the experience and outcomes of the case study participants as well. What we had learnt was that both of our participants described an improvement in their hedonic capacity, which was reflected in an improvement in the participants' scores on the standardised scale called the Dimensional Anhedonia Rating Scale, which both participants completed pre and post-study. This scale is out of 68, where a score of 44 or higher represents typical hedonic capacity. This improvement was promising, but just as interesting to us were participants' descriptions of their experience. Over the course of the study, we noticed increased descriptions of participation and motivation by both participants, such as reconnecting with activities that they'd previously enjoyed. They described how they had greater awareness of pleasure in their lives and talked about being able to intentionally connect to pleasure through music and to seek that out when they needed it. This promising outcome, well, multiple promising outcomes in fact, and these descriptions of reconnection to pleasure prompted our curiosity around what may be happening to participants' brains during this process. Was our targeted focus on musical pleasure stimulating the pleasure pathways of the brain, which were not readily activated for people with anhedonia? So this led us to study 3, our current study. We were collaborating with the Melbourne Brain Centre Imaging Unit at the University of Melbourne. In this study, which is ongoing, we aim to use the same 4-month protocol again with 8 to 10 anhedonic participants, but to undertake pre-post fMRI scans with a focus on pleasure pathways of the brain. It's been a huge learning curve so far, and we've built the fMRI paradigm and piloted it with healthy volunteers, and have recruited 6 participants into the study so far. I'm not able to report on this yet, but we're very interested to see whether or not we're able to see impacts described by participants reflected in brain imaging. So for now, I invite you to watch this space, but this is where we're currently heading. Our focus on anhedonia in this research has provided an opportunity to better understand the significance of pleasure and reward to health and well-being in general. This has relevance both when dealing with chronic illness or mental ill health, where pleasure may be a clear and targeted focus, through to more functional and psychosocial goals, where it may play a more embedded role in the therapy process. Our research suggests that when scaffolded by a flexible therapeutic relationship, musical pleasure may be an accessible and effective way to connect to pleasure and reward through a process that is necessarily individualized and highly dynamic. This has exciting potential as a way to characterize music therapy's unique contribution in healthcare in a way that centers both music and the therapeutic relationship, both essential to our work and identity as music therapists. Often in music therapy encounters that we remember as significant or meaningful, we will remember the pleasure of that encounter, an important interpersonal feeling of pleasure that's deeply connected to the therapeutic relationship and to the musical connection of that moment. And we may think of that as a byproduct of the therapeutic process. But another way to consider it is as a catalyst of that process, that musical pleasure is needed for the therapeutic impact of that moment to be possible. So I invite you all to consider the role that musical pleasure plays in your own practice. And I'll keep you updated on where our research and theory building takes us from here. Thanks very much, everyone.